Welcome to Catastrophes. This is a podcast about disasters, why disasters happen, and the factors that make them happen. We discuss the underlying hazards, the reasons why they're severe, all the way to the idea of vulnerability and why our cities, our homes, and our countries, what makes them so vulnerable and so exposed to modern day disasters. Today, we have a really interesting episode looking at the storm season or the typhoon seasons of Vietnam. So Vietnam has experienced a number of different storms over the last 2.5 months, and we're going to quickly cover some of the reasons why the events have really ranged from destructive and quite detrimental to being events that were largely mitigated because of maybe a singular action or a set of evacuations or whatnot. And we're going to cover a lot of things in chronological order over the ways that they have actually unfolded themselves. So we're actually going to be going back to August of 2025 to really start to explore what has happened in Vietnam. We're going to be covering multiple parts of the country. So I'm going to be providing a little bit of the map and to tell you where these areas are. So if you are on the YouTube platform, you're going to be able to see everything. But if you are audio only, I'm going to do my best to really paint you a picture of where in Vietnam we're going to be talking about, because we're actually going to be looking at kind of the central part of the country to the northern part. And really, we're going to be looking at a few cities in particular, one of them, Hanoi, which is in the north. It is the capital city. There's a lot of people there, and it has seen some of the most interesting development trends over the last 20 to 50 years. We're going to be exploring a few of those today. But the intent of exploring these disasters in Vietnam is not to demean or diminish the experiences of people who are facing this tragic and intense storm season, but rather explore, question, critique, and ask why these events and disasters are happening the way they are in Vietnam. And so with that, let's begin. And quickly, the difference between a typhoon, geography, but then a little bit of the way it spins, depending on where you are located according to the equator. If you're in the southern half of the hemisphere, it's going to be spinning the opposite way, counterclockwise, compared to the northern hemisphere, which is just clockwise. And that is truly the biggest difference between hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones. But what's really interesting about the South China Sea and Southeast Asia, particularly when we look at Vietnam, is the number of storms they get a year. And that's going to be kind of important to the background, because Vietnam is no stranger to storms and to typhoons as a whole. But this season has been particularly difficult and quite interesting for a lot of different reasons. There has not only been the destructive rainfall that they've seen, but also the wind speed, which is the predominant characteristic we often think about when we think about hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones. But the other thing that has really unfolded in an interesting way is the secondary effects that rainfall and wind and landslides is having on parts of Vietnam, particularly affecting some of the critical infrastructure, but also the manufacturing industry as well. We're going to cover really go into high-level details on all 5 of the storms we're going to talk about today. And then we're going to just kind of look through why some of them were destructive and what were some of the reasons for that. And I'm going to provide and go through this in chronological order. So again, we will be starting late August with Typhoon Kajiki. And if you follow my TikTok or Instagram, you might have seen some videos where I looked at Typhoon Kajiki and why it has been really unfolded the way it did. And how a lot of evacuations, upwards of anywhere from numbers range, but anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 to other areas being secure, including maritime areas where boats were secured and people who were working on those boats were actually not pulled off, but were directed to get off and go to safe harbor. We're then going to look at Typhoon Regatsa, which was a little bit of a larger typhoon as a whole in the South China Sea. And then we are going to look at Baloi, which is the typhoon that hit in kind of the end of September, early October. I think it was about September 27th to about October 1st where it really hit Vietnam. And then we're going to look at Typhoon Matmo, which was a really interesting and quite destructive typhoon to hit. Finally, we're going to kind of end it off and acknowledge the destruction of the typhoon that is happening as I record Wednesday, October 22nd, October 23rd in Vietnam, which is Typhoon Fengxi. And it is anticipated to have heavy rains and flooding, and there's no fatalities recorded as of yet. So, where to begin? Vietnam is in Southeast Asia, but it particularly is on the eastern part of Southeast Asia alongside the South China Sea, along with a number of other bodies of oceans and waters. It sees storms every year, typhoons every year. And so the important point to consider in all of this, and the biggest context I can provide people, is Vietnam is well prepared to endure typhoon season. In fact, they have some of the really interesting and well-stocked storm and emergency shelters. So when we first look at Typhoon Kajiki, which occurred on August 22nd to August 26th, late August, some of the reports vary for fatalities. We can get to that in a few moments, but the fatality range is anywhere from 3 to 17, depending on the reports. And that's largely a lot of the reason being because of the flooding and the some of the windstorms that occurred. Typhoon itself, because there is so many different areas that it hit. It actually went through the Philippines, it hit Hong Kong, it hit Macau, it hit southern China, and then Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar. It was a long-lasting storm. But what was really interesting is the typhoon itself, the highest wind speeds we see are 150 kilometers. So in terms of that mile per an hour or the kind of categorization system for most hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, it's on the lower end. And so really we have to ask, how is a typhoon of this magnitude as destructive as it was? And the 17 fatalities is across all of those different countries: Philippines, China, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. And what's really interesting about how how Vietnam has engaged and really prepared for this storm is they opened up early shelters. So Vietnam has this track record of having significant evacuation centers and really large emergency preparedness shelters. And so there are some reports, others that I've also found, which indicate that 325,000 people were evacuated as Typhoon Kajiki was on its way. Not only, again, were the people on the coastline evacuated for the places that Kajiki hit, but also we saw a lot of maritimes, a lot of shipping, and a lot of people who live and work predominantly economically as fishers or just on ports, harbors, and whatnot. They were all removed or asked to evacuate, and a lot of the ships and other reports indicate that the government and the military did a good job of ensuring that boats and whatnot were safe and that they were chained down when there was the giant storm surges. So other reports estimate that within Vietnam itself, while there was 8 people injured, 933 homes/structures damaged, one of the most critical points of damage that it basically had was the amount of farmers and the amount of land that was destroyed or damaged because of heavy rainfall. But what's interesting about particularly the central and the northern parts of Vietnam is that there are really high peaks and then there are really low lands, and parts of the country really see a bunch of that different kind of terrain. And what we understand is a lot of the rainfall that hit in the mountainous areas, well, it really flowed downhill quickly. An interesting kind of phenomena that happens when that occurs is the rainfall that goes from the mountains effectively will move downhill. And so you have that excessive rainwater causing flooding in a lot of different parts. But this was realistically just the first of a series of typhoons that hit Vietnam. And Kajiki, what it really did is it kind of prepared I think it kind of prepared the population for what was going to be a pretty destructive, and still is a destructive, storm season. And with that, we see again the wind speeds really being around 150 kilometers an hour, but really the damage being the amount of rainfall. And that is Kajiki. So what I find interesting about Kajiki also is the amount of rainfall it left. The numbers for measurements in particular areas is kind of all over the map. What we can really take away from this point, or Kajiki, is because of where it hit in the central and the northern parts, kind of that north central, mid central part of Vietnam, there was a significant amount of people displaced. Again, reports range from evacuated versus displaced. Some reports suggest that there's over 580,000 evacuations, and then they were able to go back. So again, that number of displaced versus evacuations kind of tends to differ. We see approximately 80,000 people be displaced, according to some sources, whereas evacuations, there was upwards to 580,000 evacuations. Significant amount. And again, comes back to this idea of having well-stocked emergency shelters. That really takes us, we really see kind of the beginning of September, the end of August be really the beginning of the season, where we see the big storms start to come. And that really brings us to Typhoon Ragazza, which is for the South China Sea and the areas near the Philippines, China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan. It really hits some of these countries hard. And I think wouldn't do it justice to say that in the Philippines there was a significant amount of destruction. But when we look at Vietnam, as it makes landfall in Vietnam, it is closer to a tropical storm than it is the big hurricane, typhoon, cyclone that the media would really portray. Vietnam itself experiences another roundabout or another significant downpour of rainfall. And again, this is the second large rainfall for the middle, the central, and the northern parts of the country. And what I find interesting about Ragazza is that it makes landfall on September 25th, and the amount of coastal damage it brings, particularly the storm surges and the high waves, are pretty destructive. But more to the point, the Vietnamese government and whatnot, they're able to prepare in a manner that they know that this is coming and it has hit the Philippines. So they're able to relocate populations that are close and exposed to the coastline, and they're able to really, again, stock the storm shelters. From what we understand, there is no severe, not total damage as there was some of the other typhoons we're going to cover. But we also see and note that there are no deaths and no fatalities that I'm able to confirm at this point. And with that, and why I want to bring up Ragazza, is the amount of rainfall in 1 month is pretty significant. And so over the course of a month, the natural systems might start to kind of return to a normal-ish level. September and October are rainy months for Vietnam. So this ecosystem, the environment, is used to heavy rainfall, monsoon seasons. But the amount of rainfall just in late August and September is astronomical. And part of it, some of the information I don't have available, is the buildup of rainfall, I believe, starts to overwhelm a lot of the infrastructure and capacity of some cities, some of the provinces, and then some of the actual farmland and the dams that are starting to basically feel the effects of these disasters all in a row. So those two really, again, set up the conditions for what Vietnam will go through, because Beloy is a typhoon that certainly has a lot more direct effects, but then also has quite a bit more damage in terms of total cost. So according to local sources, in Vietnam, Typhoon or Storm Beloy is a typhoon that leaves quite a bit of destruction. As of now, there are 29 deaths and over $303 million worth of damages. And the economic effects, along with just the long lingering effects of rainwater and floods, really can't be understated. And this is where we start to see some of the secondary effects. And what I would argue, a little bit of a buildup of water and really the downpour, the deluges of floods and water that they received in the previous two storms. So I'm going to break it down into a number of different categories. I run through some of this information. But from what we understand, Beloy in Vietnam really made landfall around September 28th, 29th, and then it lasted until October 1st, kind of proceeding all the way through Southeast Asia. And what's interesting about Beloy itself is 91 houses were completely destroyed, but over 145,000 homes were either damaged or lost their roofs. But what's really interesting is the amount of flooding Storm Beloy actually caused. Well, there's reports that suggest that more than 20,000 homes were completely submerged with water or underwater, which is a startling amount. There's also some YouTube videos and some social media videos going around circulating where tourists were literally in cities and they had to walk in chest-high water around to get to one place to another. And a lot of these videos, they downplay a lot of the actual effects and perhaps maybe have a perspective that, it's kind of novel or it's cool to go through these things in the sense of like they're tourists and it's one of those things that they'll never see again. Whereas the reality is those storms and the amount of water is significant. And it is something that Vietnam has seen in the past. And it's not normal. And that's one of the problems I might have with some of these YouTube videos and these clips is that they sort of normalize and say like, oh, it happens here. But realistically, they do get lots of rainwater and some floods, but they don't get it to that extent. And so perhaps it is the new normal, but I don't ever believe we should be kind of normalizing a new normal where there's floodwaters up to your chest. Anyways. So with over 20,000 homes fully submerged, the amount of water in some of the provinces, particularly the northern or the north of central region, so Thanh Hoi, which is south of Hanoi, is one of the areas that got hit pretty devastatingly. And same with Day Na, which is where I would consider the central part of Vietnam is. Again, continuing on, when we look at the amount of floodwater, it's very widespread. So not only is there damage to homes, but also education. So there's 1,076 schools that are affected, either closed, not opening, or damaged as a whole. In terms of the agricultural production and the farmland that is in these regions, there's over 34,000 hectares of rice and crops destroyed, where 10,000 acres of aquacultural farms are wiped out, which is really interesting. So not only do we have the effect on land, but also within our seas. And one of the reports that I talked about a little bit earlier, talking about how the Vietnamese government and the military both coordinated, and they really tried to prevent boats, ships, harbors, and docks from being outwardly destroyed in the first two storms. And the reason is because those are really difficult things to recover and recuperate quickly. People still need to live and work, and if you can't go back to your job, it becomes that much more difficult to recover. So in the first two, I think the government themselves set parts of the regions up and for success in the sense of evacuations and preparing communities for these things to happen. Whereas Beloy, we see so much damage that with the evacuations, they certainly reduced a lot of the damage and the impact to people's lives and the lowered fatality. But the amount and the widespread nature of this damage really affected a lot of people. Continuing on, so not only do we see the floodwaters affect the agriculture, but also livestock. And these numbers are from a website that conducts pretty accurate news. I've used them before and I've looked through comments suggesting that they are fairly accurate. So, but again, these are numbers that are right after the event, so take it for what you will. But floodwaters swept away or killed 1,105 cattle, 179,000 chicken or poultry, and had 60,000 trees uprooted. One of the big and secondary effects that we know about is the impact on the dikes and the dams throughout Vietnam. And this is notable. The storm also caused 22 incidences involving dike breaches that led to nearly 20,000 meters of riverbank and coastal erosion. The dikes and the dams throughout Vietnam are not necessarily prepared to receive this much rainfall in a short amount of time. Additionally, when wind and also just general landslides, rock, different kinds of winds hit these buildings, it takes a toll on them. And there's, even if we prepare them and maintain them well, a lot of buildings still go through kind of that long-term kind of damage from these astronomical events. So there was a number of dike breaches and dam breaches that we will come back to, and when we talk about the secondary effects. Next, we also note that there's landslides, road collapses, and traffic issues all throughout the central and the northern provinces. Additionally, and I think a point to note is that approximately 1.4 million people had to have their power restored within a few days. Overall, from what we understand, and within the census data, so people who are under the census and accounted for, there is approximately 2.7 million people, 2.7 million households, which are left without power for a number of days. And so this is a really interesting talking point, I think, the electricity, power, and households, and categorizing electrical and power loss by household. And it is something I tend to prefer instead of just per person, because we don't actually know how many people live in one unit or one house or one apartment block. So by looking at the total number of households and looking at how many lost power, we can actually see there's that widespread and kind of that second and third effect power loss has on people. How many people have food in the fridge right now, or food in a freezer, or are relying on air conditioning, or relying on power to do their schoolwork or watch this video? So there's kind of that second and third effect of power loss. And depending on how long you lose power for, that really will multiply or influence the effect itself. So a notable number. Within Hanoi, we note that heavy rains caused flooding on some of the major streets, and water levels ranged from 20 centimeters to over 1 meter. So again, that chest-high water in some locations. For Typhoon Beloy, we note that there's $303 million US in damage that they are still recovering and still doing work to recuperate. The thing is that is Storm Beloy, and that is the third of 5 that we are really going to look at. The next one is Typhoon Matmo, which we're going to spend just a little bit more time on because it has certainly some of the interesting effects, but then also has a number of secondary effects that I think are worth talking about. So Typhoon Matmo was one of the more destructive typhoons to hit Vietnam. And perhaps there's a little bit of buildup in terms of the amount of damage that has already happened. And then we just say, all the damage is according to just this one typhoon, realistically. But because there's just been so much damage already, so much impact, it might be fair to say that each one of the typhoons and storms has had their own effect. It's just difficult to quantify. But overall, there has been quite a bit of damage. Typhoon Matmo, however, is a Category 2 typhoon. And so that categorization system really, again, looks at just wind speed. Peak wind speed in terms of the 1 minute sustained period. So if you have 1 minute of 160 kilometer winds, then it's going to be a category 2. And then we keep on going up and up from there. We don't really look at rainfall or whatnot in terms of the hurricane metrics. There are other measurements used in the Japanese Meteorology Agency and a number of other institutions that kind of account a little bit for rainfall, but I digress. Within Typhoon Matmo, it formed on October 1st and then starts to go through from the 1st to the 6th of October. So early October, after 3 previous storms, we're starting to see even a little bit more damage. And a storm that has particularly high wind speeds compared to the other 2. The difficulty with Matmo is it is damaging in the sense of the economic cost and loss to the economy for Vietnam is pretty significant. But really where we see Vietnam be hit by Matmo is the amount of rainfall that the country receives, particularly in the northern part. So Thai Nguyen, which is a province just northeast of Hanoi, again in the northern part of Vietnam, is one of the places that I want to spend just a few minutes looking at. And when we consider how Matmo unfolded, well, it unleashed significant rainfall. But the result of that rainfall and an already saturated parts of the country filled with rain and water, well, there was additional flooding in a lot of the different provinces, particularly in Hanoi, but then in a lot of the northern parts, in a lot of the northern provinces in the country. When we look, the secondary effects of that rainfall caused a few subsequent disasters in themselves. We're going to just spend a few minutes on those after I've covered this one. But as a whole, and what we understand from the actual amount of damage and effects from Matmo, well, as of, this is October 10th, so we still could be collecting information and data, but Matmo in Vietnam killed 16 people alone, injured many. Some reports suggest 10 or more, but we still don't know the full effects. But we also note that a lot of the damages are from the flooding, but then also landslides. The northern parts of Vietnam and some of the provinces have really high mountains, like I talked about before, and are prone to landslides when there's a lot of flooding. So we actually see quite a bit of this. We see significant flooding, which knocks out roadways, highways, and really affects a lot of industry. And again, one of the things I keep coming back to with Vietnam and their defense/emergency management agencies is this idea of, well, what about people who live on the coastline, who are very vulnerable and exposed to some of these events and the storm surges and the wind and whatnot? What about the economies of, the sea, the harbors, the ports, fishing, and the aquaculture? And there are a number of reports to suggest that while vessel captains, owners of boats, and others who are near the coastline and who use boats often, well, they were instructed to stay informed about the storm's position, but then also take precautionary measures to ensure that their boat wasn't lost or that their farms and whatnot weren't totally damaged and affected, so that they could stay safe and recover them had something happened. And I think this is a really interesting nuance. We often hear about the evacuations on land, but how do we prepare the coastlines and the people who live in these areas that are going to get hit? And as a whole, and again, we don't understand or we don't know the full effect of all these storms, and I don't know if we will for another quite a few months or even perhaps a year from now. But over the material I've read a lot of collaboration between the government and their pushing of the message to have people secure themselves, get safe, and know that this storm is coming and it's going to hit you. And I think that's a really interesting proponent. Finally, on October 18th, the final typhoon to this date, Typhoon Fengxi, started to form, and we note that it was closely going to be hitting the central parts of Vietnam, just south of Da Nang. And we note that there could be, again, heavy rainstorms and the risk of flooding. While there's no fatalities yet, this is something worth monitoring, and I think it's probably worth re-looking and seeing what has happened. And again, I'm recording on October 22nd, just as the storm will be making landfall. Now I want to really focus on just a few highlights or a few secondary effects of the storm. So I talked a lot about the overall direct impact to some of the farming, the buildings themselves, but I think it's important to just take a moment and reflect on, well, what about like that secondary effect? So what I mean is, what about hydroelectric power, dams, berms, dikes? And when we look at the dam breaks and the dike breaks, the failures in them, we actually see, particularly in the regions of Thai Nguyen, which is in the northeast part of the country, we see a significant amount of homes inundated in this region. So again, the reports range on overall how many homes have been inundated over the past 2 months. And there was one news source that I wasn't able to officially confirm, suggesting that between the two typhoons and the two storms that hit the northern part of the country, that there was over 200,000 homes that were flooded or had some form of damage. And these homes were in sometimes the rural parts of the country, where they might have been farmers or they might have been part of the livestock and just farming industry. But what's really interesting about Thai Nguyen and what has happened there, the secondary effect, is the dike breach risk and the dam collapse itself. So overall, we've seen a number of additional floods because of some of the breaks in dikes and dams. In fact, one report suggests that the Bac K, one hydropowered dam in northern Vietnam, has collapsed, and that after the series of heavy rains that not only Kajiki and Beloy and Matmo brought, that those damages have really influenced a lot of the surrounding communities. So much so that estimates range from $2 million US in damages to a number of homes around the region and whatnot being hit. But one of the interesting things that has happened in Thai Nguyen itself is the overall widespread flooding and how it has affected several different industries. So one of them was a sludge factory that produced basically waste, and they received so much additional rainfall around and in the community that the facility itself had a leak and started basically having contaminant kind of leak out. And the difficulty of that contamination and leaking into water, wastewater, and waterways is that it's really difficult to clean up and to ensure that it doesn't affect people. So downstream from in waterways and rivers, there now has to be a concerted effort to make sure that there's no contaminant. And again, kind of just that secondary effect. But what I think is really interesting is the current and the continued watch of the dike system in Thai Nguyen and how they are going about and trying to ensure that, well, if there is going to be a break, that they can evacuate and have alarmed people. And with that, that is realistically the information that I was able to confirm, to double check. And I want to thank you for staying with me all the way up until this point. I greatly appreciate you being here. This storm series for Vietnam, I think, is a really interesting culmination of events that we are seeing, just in a place that maybe has perceived low capacity to respond, but realistically punches above their weight on like the media perspective. Vietnam does a really good job of emergency shelters and preparedness, evacuations, always alerting people and ensuring that, there is coordination between levels of government. But at the same time, they've seen 5 storms in the span of 2.5 months that are really destructive in the amount of rainfall they're bringing, but also the wind speed, the storm surges, the landslides, those secondary effects that are coming. So with that is all the information I got about Vietnam. If you have any more information or anything you thought was interesting, please comment. You can also leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And I will be covering a few more of Typhoon Fenchi and other storms that hit Vietnam on my social media. And please let me know what you thought of this episode. Greatly appreciate any sort of feedback. And with that, that's all I got. Thanks.